Hey everyone, welcome to Chapter 1 of Microbiology. We're using the OpenStax Microbiology textbook. In this chapter, we'll be talking about what our ancestors knew about microbes. So this is prior to the knowledge that microbes actually exist. We'll talk about some of the important individuals who led to the discovery of the field of microbiology. And we'll talk about the different microbes that make up the organisms that we study. So what our ancestors knew. So this is the first part of this chapter. And one of the first things that that I always like to talk about is what causes disease. So today we know that diseases can be caused by a lot of different things. They can be caused by our genetics. They can be caused by our habits. And a lot of times diseases are caused by microbes. Some are living and some are non-living, but microbes cause a lot of the diseases that we face. In the past, people thought that disease was caused by supernatural powers. If you did something wrong, or if your family did something wrong, or if your community did something wrong, then God would punish you or your entire community. They might send a plague down as a punishment. And the cure was to make your God happy again. And that could be by doing a lot of weird things. Physicians at that time would evaluate the 4 different humors, so fluids in the body. And as long as those 4 different humors were in balance, then you were in perfect health. So kind of along the lines of homeostasis. These always had to stay balanced, and then you would always stay healthy. If there was any imbalance, that would cause a problem. So the 4 humors were yellow bile, black bile, phlegm, and blood. And each was associated with a different environmental substance like fire, air, water, earth. And some were considered hot, some were considered cold, dry, or wet. And so here's some information about what each of the humors brought to an individual. So if you were a melancholic individuals, then these individuals tended to have more black bile, whereas people that were considered choleric were considered to have a high amount of yellow bile. Sanguinic individuals had blood as their primary humor, and phlegmatic had phlegm as their primary humor. And they each had different characteristics, but as long as they kept their humors in balance, they stayed healthy, according to Hippocrates. If the humors became unbalanced, then they were considered diseased, and you had to treat the disease to bring the humors back into balance. So how did they get treated? Well, it depended on which humor was unbalanced. So some treatments would be associated with removal of one of the fluids. So bloodletting was an example. A lot of times when people were ill, they thought, well, you have too much blood, especially if your skin started turning red. That was a sign that you had too much blood, and so they would remove blood from your system. So let's now think about that. If you have too much, or if you are very red, you're ill and you're very red, what is likely happening? Your body temperature is increasing, and when your body temperature increases, it causes a fever, and that's actually beneficial, right? That's actually causing your own immune system to fight off the disease. If we take blood out, we're actually removing white blood cells, antibodies, everything that could treat you. So this was a very dangerous process, but they believed that this was how to treat an individual. If someone had seizures, so if they were epileptic, they would drill a hole in the skull to remove the excess pressure, thinking that that was what was causing the problem. And so here we have an individual having their skull removed. These are obviously just pictures, but the idea is still here. They didn't know about our immune system. They didn't know about the bacteria or viruses that could infect the body. And though some individuals believed that there was some invisible disease-causing agent, since it couldn't be proved, this is how they treated people. So with that being said, yay that we live in a time where we have much better medical care, right? So anytime you've ever been in a hospital and you've been angry because you had to wait, more than 5 minutes, just remember that in the past, you might not have even been seen by a doctor. You might have just had the local hair cutter come to your place and cut you and remove blood from your body instead of actually treating the disease. So, though a lot of people thought that diseases were caused by gods being angry, there were many who theorized that infection and disease were caused by living things that were just not able to be seen. And they also thought that disease could be spread through stench or smelly air. So the miasmic hypothesis stated that disease spread by smell, or that if the air that you were breathing smelled bad, you were likely to get diseased. And for this reason, in Rome, they actually made one of the first sewage systems. And so this took waste material away from the city, from the people, and moved it to a river. So not the most sanitary thing. I mean, just dumping it into a river just causes other problems, but that's not something that they were thinking about. They were just trying to get the smell away from the city. So prior to this, a lot of places would dump their waste pots just in the streets, and that definitely was not sanitary. There we go. So Hippocrates, 460 to 370 BC, didn't believe in supernatural forces. He actually thought that there was something inside the body or within the environment that was causing disease. Thucydides, 460 to 400 BC, observed that survivors of the Athenian plague didn't get reinfected when caring for sick. So he thought, maybe there's this something about getting a disease that you're now protected from that disease. Varro, 116 to 27 BC, things we can't see might cause disease. So here we have an individual talking about these invisible microbes. But it wasn't until the 1600s that we actually were able to start seeing microbes. And so Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch drapist, created one of the first lenses that was strong enough to actually see microorganisms. So here's what his microscope looked like. It's a very, very simple microscope, but it was definitely a microscope, and here you can see it being used by an individual. So he was a Dutch drapist, and he actually initially made this microscope so that he could look at the threads on the drapes he was making, because he made drapes for very rich people and he wanted more money. Eventually, though, Leeuwenhoek decided that he wanted to look at other things. He was like, I can see these threads and the drapes, and he could make sure that they looked really well or really good. Then he started thinking about other substances he could look at. And so he scraped some of the plaque off his teeth and started looking at that. And then he took pond water, and he even looked at sperm under a microscope. So he looked at a lot of different, or I should say semen under a microscope, and saw sperm. But he looked at a lot of things, and it was really interesting, and he made drawings. And so this is where we started to realize that I shouldn't say we, but they started to realize that definitely there were things that were not able to be seen by the unaided eye that were living. So this leads us to the golden age of microbiology. So in 1820, or I won't say this date, 1822 to 1895 is when Louis Pasteur was alive. He actually did a lot for the field of microbiology, but one of the major things he did was he disproved this process called spontaneous generation. So this was a theory that people believed for hundreds and hundreds of years. So spontaneous generation is the theory that living things come from non-living materials. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, I think, in chapter 3. But for now, just note that this is what people believed. And it was a theory, just like the cell theory is a theory. The cell theory states that we're all composed of cells, and cells produce new cells. And so you're composed of cells. We know that is true. You can take scrapings of your arm, of your cheek, and you can see cells. So theories in biology are as concrete in general as laws are in physics. But, so all scientists believe it, which is what that means. But this was disproved. And so we never have a law because life is constantly changing, and we can, you can always find out new things. So that's why it's always called a theory. It's never called a law. But the idea that this was a theory means that everyone believed that living things came from non-living materials. And this actually was the theory for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it didn't get disproven until close to the 1860s. So not even 200 years ago, people still really believed this. He also was really important in the field of microbiology. He demonstrated that certain bacteria bacteria could ferment, and yeast could ferment. He invented pasteurization, named for him, and he was one of the first to develop vaccines. Robert Koch, raised or born in 1843 until 1910. He was one of the first individuals to show a connection between a specific disease and a specific microbe. So he came up with Koch's postulates, which we use today still to help us in determining during epidemiology, or in epidemiology, to determine the causative agent of specific diseases. He found the cause of anthrax, cholera, and tuberculosis using his postulates. He also, in doing all of this, he also was able to, or had to develop mechanisms for growing microbes. And so a lot of our aseptic techniques and the media that we use can be credited to Robert Koch. So now let's look at a different area of microbiology. I'm actually going to stop here, and I'll get into the next video because this has already been almost 15 minutes. So I'll get into the second video, which will probably be the rest of the chapter, okay? Bye.